Welcome to another show where I get to speak to incredible people from around the world, incredible leaders, I should say, from around the world. And today's leader is no less. He's been on the leadership ladder for many a decade. I'm not saying he's old, but I am saying he's very, very experienced. And I took the opportunity of reading through his bio this morning, and I was absolutely fascinated. It sounds like we come from the same we could have been cut from the same cloth, Nigel. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
It's great to have you here. So, Nigel, you're a chartered champion of the Chartered Management Institute. You're head of professional qualifications at the Inspirational Development Group. I love that title, by the way. Past director for National Centre for Strategic Leadership. You've been a consultant, you've been a lecturer, all around the theme of leadership. What is it about leadership that really gets you, that inspires you to move forward?
I guess like a lot of people who really want to be good at it, it's mostly started with me being bloody useless at it. And my first CEO role in my 20s, I had no clue. I did everything backwards and wrong. And in the end, my friend whose company it was, who'd asked me to come in and take the job, had a quiet word with me and said, "This isn't really for you, is it?" And I spent several months then licking my wounds and thinking, what just happened? I thought I was clever. How come I'm not good at this? And started what's turned out to be a lifelong journey of trying to understand what a leader should really be there to do. You know, I was being a boss.
Yeah. And there's a big difference between a boss and a leader, isn't there? I think this is something that I've learned over the many decades that I've been involved in this sort of, what do I call it? Do I call it some sort of science or some mystery? Because leadership continues to be a bit of a mystery, and I think it needs to be, because otherwise we stop growing.
Yeah, exactly that. And I think there's an alchemy involved in this too, in that it's not just about you, it's about the relationships with other people. So therefore, your leadership changes because of them, and or at least it should, you know, and they shape the way you approach things if you're paying attention. And I think for a lot of leaders, perhaps they're not paying enough attention to that. So.
I agree. And don't you think that leadership also changes with the changing times in which we exist? You know, very often we've heard the phrase, the VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. And I think the world has never been more VUCA than it is now, particularly over the last few years. So leadership styles and leadership thinking needs to change and adapt with the changing circumstances in the world as well, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I think particularly thinking about your kind of premise around the whole idea of human-centered and emotional intelligence things, those things were always critically important, but it's become obvious now to a lot of people who wouldn't have believed that 5 years ago. You know, that there's certain things that I speak at conferences about this stuff sometimes. And one of the people I often share a platform with, they talk about male suicide and how that's now the single biggest killer of men under the age of 55, you know, more than cancer or drinking or road traffic accidents or any of those kind of things. And that's terrifying, you know, that half the human race feels so disenfranchised, disconnected, unsure of themselves, lacking in confidence and self-esteem, that they'd rather end it than find a way. That scares the hell out of me, you know. And so I've been working a lot on the way people think and why they think the way they do, and things like, you know, empathy and emotional intelligence, and also mental toughness, which is an area I work in a lot, is about actually being there for people when they need you as a leader. And if you're too busy worrying about you, how can you do that?
I find that fascinating, Nigel, because, you know, if we'd have, and you talk about 5 years ago, in the last 5 years, this focus around emotional intelligence, human-centered kind of leadership has really evolved and really grown. Isn't it fascinating that while it's always been important, it's only really taken hold over the last 5 years? And it demonstrates the agility and the adaptability that we need to have as leaders, and to understand how the horizon is constantly changing. And I think you're right. I think, you know, certainly the whole lockdown experience and that isolated working and all of this kind of stuff, I think that's really played into the greater need for people to be connected and have relationships based on trust.
Exactly that. Yeah. And you think what we've done to trust in leaders across every spectrum over recent years, political ones, you know, whatever they might be, it's no surprise that that's a challenge for us.
Yeah.
And like you say, it was always true. And yet now, even those who would have said it was nonsense can't avoid recognizing the problem now and the issues that need to be addressed. And the relationships that people have had in a workplace, I've often felt, have been based on job title. I'm the this,
Yeah.
therefore I
Yeah.
outrank you because you're that.
That whole hierarchical leadership kind of approach. Yeah.
And I will speak to you as if that's who you are. And in fact, you're just another person like me, trying to do the best you can for your stakeholders and your team. And that stuff is just nonsense. Yeah.
Why do you think it is, Nigel, that even in this world where there is this recognition that, hey, these are the kind of leaders that we need to be much more focused on the people in our organization or the stakeholders that we operate with, whether they be client or, chairmen of boards, etc., etc. We need to be much more focused around those relationships and the human beings behind the relationships. So why is it that some organizations, do you think, still operate in that sort of hierarchical approach, that hiding behind status, ranks, or titles?
Cultures are hard to shift, aren't they? You find that when an organisation has a way of doing things, it's the old Drucker thing about culture eating strategy for breakfast. That if you come in with all kinds of wonderful ideas and intentions and what you're going to do, you'll get assimilated by the Borg very quickly, because the organisation will show you and teach you how to behave. So that's one factor, I think, that makes it hard for people to shift it unless you get a kind of groundswell and a sufficient connection with people for a lot of you to want to change it. But I think another thing is that we reward the old behaviours. We're still promoting people in a lot of organisations for being tough and dynamic and decisive and hitting their targets and this kind of thing. And we should be rewarding people for creating happiness and engagement and innovation and atmosphere and all those kind of things. And actually, in a lot of organizations, that's still seen as not doing the job properly. We use that whole hard and soft thing. And it's always amazed me. I've always said, I wrote a thing about this years ago that said, hard's easy and soft is hard.
And it's easier to be driven by KPIs, things that you can tangibly measure, than to be driven by the culture within your organization, the personality, the feeling within your organization. I always say that, if you inspire people to do something, they will do it far better and work to the nth degree than if you tell people to do something. They'll only work to the minimum standard. And you know what? We've got this new phraseology that's kicking about over the last couple of years. We've heard of the Great Resignation, of course. And then we've heard of quiet quitting, where people work to the minimum standards. And there's a new phrase that I heard the other day, loud quitting, which I think is really about, symbolizes really all of the industrial action that's going on, where people feel that they literally cannot do anything more aside from taking industrial action to wake up their bosses, their leaders, or the government, whoever it may be.
Yeah, exactly so. And that's it. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I've always been very pro the idea of labour movements and trade unions and things for exactly that reason, because sometimes in a large organisation, that's the only time the senior leaders hear the truth as other people see it, because they don't have often life experiences that enable them to empathise for real. We've talked about this before, this idea that we still have a senior leadership cohort in a lot of areas of society that started in the upper middle and moved up to the top, and they've never experienced what it's like to not be able to afford to pay the rent, or to not have enough food on the table, or to just feel like you're powerless and unable to affect things, and they don't know what that's like.
Yeah, you and I were chatting about, both of us have come from working class backgrounds. I'm one of 9 people living in a 2.5 bedroom terraced house, but still had a happy childhood. But I think that really has grounded me and shaped me to become the leader that I am. And similar with yourself, council house, estate that you lived on, and it shaped you as a leader.
It has, and my natural rebelliousness, which is slightly less obvious now than it was probably 30 years ago, but not much, has always led me to challenge the status quo and ask lots of questions. And generally speaking, that's not acceptable behaviour in a lot of organisations. It got me expelled from school. It got me fired from a number of jobs, but it also enabled me to decide that I've had enough of this and go off to around the world as a musician, where I was in my own master of my own destiny. And when I came back, I was a different person, because I'd learned to trust myself. Most of my rebelliousness came from a lack of confidence, often, rather than confidence. but I recognize when I'm talking to a lot of leaders that our road to that point has been very different, and as a consequence, it's impossible for me to understand what it feels like to be them, and vice versa. And the more real conversations we have with people, and the more relationship building we do, the closer together we'll get. And we don't often create the space for it in organizations because we're so busy doing things and, trying to complete to-do lists or attend meetings on our calendar or, respond to emails. There's all these tasks going on that even before pandemic prevented people from talking to each other. I remember running a program for a group of senior leaders from a global organization, crikey, probably 25 years ago, and was horrified to discover there was 3 people in the room who worked on the same floor in a building in their country and emailed each other regularly and had never met. And you think,
That's incredible.
yeah, and that was long before the days of a pandemic. That was just, they were so busy sitting in front of their computer doing work, even though there was somebody 30 feet away that they needed to work alongside, they just emailed each other.
Well, we've all heard stories, haven't we? And I've seen this in practice where people literally have offices next door to each other and they're emailing each other rather than just nipping across next door and having a conversation, which actually could be much deeper. We rely on this sort of electronic communication, and it's happening more and more, isn't it, now with social media?
Yeah, for sure, absolutely. And we've seen some of the toxicity that results from that. Although clearly it has good things too. I wouldn't have any connection with my family and friends who now live a long way away if it wasn't for Facebook, the old person's version of social media. And it is interesting, isn't it, that I've got a paper going out today actually on IDG's website about this. That I used to share an office in my days in education with a chap who was extremely introverted and overly polite, probably would be the way to put it. He once reached over my shoulder to put a post-it note with a message on it whilst I'm sitting in the chair. It was like, that was an epiphany for me. It was like, what are you doing? But he was so paranoid about interrupting me when I was working or about having to have a conversation that he'd rather write it on a post-it note from 2 feet away and reach over my shoulder and put it on my screen.
But this is diversity. We talk about diversity all the time, and often when we do talk about diversity, it's sort of geared around representation, demographic diversity, and protected characteristics. I mean, I don't agree with that because I think it homogenizes people, it stereotypes people, and actually it's counterintuitive when it comes to diversity. And true diversity is really 2 things for me. One, recognizing everybody is different. Every single one of us is different. We've all walked a different path. And secondly, is the true inclusion when it comes to diversity is embracing people's ideologies, thoughts, and ideas. And to create creativity and innovation in your organization. But the problem isn't it, that we still have, as you quite rightly say, people at senior levels in many, many organizations who think and come from a similar background. And consequently, what you're having is that the status quo is maintained because there's no generation of new ideas. And in part, if you look across some of the public sector organizations, this is happening. We've seen this playing out right now. Whereas the ground floor is getting really frustrated, they can see that the landscape has changed and they want to do things in a new way. They want to challenge the way they've always done things. You still have some of the higher echelons where they are very much stuck in a singular kind of mindset. And because they're surrounded by similar people thinking in a similar way, that weight is holding them back from being more creative and really living in embracing the modern world.
Yeah, and you see when you get somebody coming in, particularly as the most senior leader, with a different view about this stuff, that it can be shifted, but it's really hard, and it constantly tries to shift back. And you can understand why. I've used the phrase, turkeys don't vote for Christmas many times. A lot of those people. They need it to be maintained because that's their protection. That's their community. And if it changes too much, will they become obsolete? I mean, I think they have already. They just don't realize it. But yeah, it is a challenge for a lot of those leaders because the current paradigm or the old traditional paradigm serves them well. You see people we talked about political situations. You see people there in political situations who have the right sound and the right kind of connections, but do they actually have the skills needed to do that job well? Do they actually have the respect and followership from their own people that only happens, as you were saying before, through the intrinsic motivation that comes from trust? If they don't have any of that stuff, then it becomes Disneyland, I think, in a lot of organizations. There was an old saying back in the communist days of Russia. They used to say, we pretend to work, and in return they pretend to pay us. And I see that in organizations
Yes,
quite often, where you've got people all doing a role play. Now, I'm role playing being in charge, you're role playing being subservient and doing my bidding. And actually, we're both kidding. Yeah. So let's get real.
Reminds me of something else that we discussed just before we went on air. And we were talking about how in so many organizations, I'm certainly finding this in the work that I do, and we do very similar work, and you must be finding this. In so many organizations, people have managed to get themselves into very senior leadership positions. But in many, many of those organizations, these people have never received any kind of robust leadership development. How is that even possible? How is it that organizations are elevating people into these incredibly responsible positions with high levels of authority and not investing in those people to equip them with the leadership skills?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember when I was first appointed CEO at the National Centre for Strategic Leadership, one of the first things we did was to go out. I kind of rented a few PhD final year students to go out and do interviews with CEOs around the area, and to find out firstly, whether they did anything about their own leadership development, and if not, why not? And it was very interesting that for a lot of them, they associated leadership development with improving their CV. And they'd already made it, so why would they bother to do that? They don't need to. And rather than seeing it as getting better at the job. I mentioned the phrase mental toughness earlier. I mean, one of the things that I'm working on at the moment is this whole idea about where does people's fortitude come from? And mental toughness doesn't mean being hard. It means being robust and resilient and having bounce back ability and all those kind of things. And one of the things that we've found that's been very interesting is that one of the things that is measured is interpersonal confidence compared to confidence in own abilities. And there's so often a massive disparity between those two. There are people who appear confident and have all the right social skills, are actually lying awake at night worrying about the fact that they can't do things.
Yeah, I find this an awful lot. I'd mentioned earlier on that, our specialism, if you like, is emotional intelligence. And when we look at emotional intelligence, we break it down into 26 granular competencies. And often, and one of those is around personal power, something that we call personal power, which is your own level of self-esteem, self-belief. But one is around the interpersonal skills. And very often I find that people who have high levels of interpersonal skills don't necessarily equate to having high levels of confidence within themselves. And consequently, what's happening is it pulls down their overall level of EQ. So if we just develop that personal confidence, that personal self-esteem, actually it can elevate the whole of the EQ and actually go on to improve the interpersonal relationships as well. But I want to take you back to this phrase mental toughness, because if you'd have said that to me, I don't know, maybe 5-6 years ago, what I would have read from that phrase is that I need to be tough with people. I need to drive targets. I need to be very task orientated. I still remember that, when I was in the police service, I was heading up various departments. I was one of the most moved superintendents, taking over departments that weren't doing so well, and turning them around. But I remember towards the latter end of my service that my chief actually turned around to me and said, "Yeah, but I don't see you gripping people, Kul. I don't see you gripping people." And my question really was, well, has the performance improved? Have the grievances gone down? Are people happier? Do people work harder? If that's all going in the right direction, then does it matter that I'm going around gripping people or not? This is the old-fashioned reliance on being mentally tough. And I think you're right. I think real mental toughness is about managing our own thoughts, being able to become vulnerable with people. I was just having this conversation yesterday with a group of psychologists. To be vulnerable with people takes an incredible amount of courage, but the reward that you get from that in terms of the level of trust that you build is just incredible. So mental toughness has changed in terms of language and definition, hasn't it?
For definite. And you're right. The EQ aspect is central to it. Yeah, because what we're not trying to do is encourage leaders to build a shell around themselves. That's what they've been doing in many cases over
Yep.
the last 30, 40 years. We want them to take it down, dismantle it, but still be able to withstand the kind of slings and arrows of outrageous fortune that hit them as a consequence when they haven't got their deflector shields up anymore. Whenever I'm working with leaders, I'm trying to bring together their confidence in their own abilities with their interpersonal confidence so that it's real, because otherwise it's a veneer. And for a lot of them, it is. It's a veneer that they've put up for their own protection, but don't realise it's actually preventing them from having fulfilling relationships with people because they're not real.
Yeah, it just sort of acts as a force field, doesn't it? It's a barrier between effective communication, real communication between them and other people as well.
Absolutely. I mean, Professor Peter Clough at Hull was the guy who kind of took this thinking to its nth degree and developed an assessment tool around it, etc. That I use, and it's very interesting to see how people's profiles. I mean, in essence, it's quite simple. It just looks at 4 areas and splits each of them in half and gives marks out of 10 for where somebody is on the scale. And the variation you see in some people is so insightful in terms of explaining to you why they are the way they are and why you've experienced the relationship with them that you have, or maybe the challenges you've had with them. You can see it in there, that their commitment to delivering on their promises is really low, even though they're high in interpersonal confidence. So they seem like they're really on it and that they're right with you, but actually they're not. Or their self-esteem, their confidence in abilities is so low that it's getting in the way because they're afraid to try things in case they fail.
Do you think, we hear an awful lot about how people have been impacted upon by, the whole lockdown experience, working in isolation. Do you actually think that we may be seeing an increase in people's self-esteem being affected as a result?
Yeah, and I absolutely. And what I've experienced so far, which may or may not be symptomatic, is that it makes them more like they were before. So if they already lacked in confidence, it gets even more so.
It's almost like a magnifying glass then.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you see it as a consequence. I mean, for me, although I'm one of the clinically extremely vulnerable, so I was isolated for more than 2 years. But then I live on the Norfolk coast, so I was isolated already.
You're isolated anyway.
Yeah, avian flu is more dangerous to me with all the geese out here.
I have to say, I must visit Norfolk. I've not been in 2 or 3 decades.
Oh, it's wonderful. Yeah, come over and see me. We'll have lunch.
Definitely.
But so I think for me, it actually it played to my strengths. It helped me to have more time to think and to be able to design and develop new things that I never got time to do because I was busy attending meetings that did nothing. And now I suddenly have a bandwidth issue and can't attend. I'm only kidding, guys. But
Love it.
It's interesting. Whereas I've seen others who were struggling to feel comfortable and confident and suffered from imposter syndrome. And sometimes it's made it worse because now they're not getting the signals, they're not getting the feedback, they're not getting the support. Because whenever they go into a meeting with their boss, in inverted commas, they talk about stuff about achievement and what things have got to be done next, and the human content has been filtered out.
I think, though, we went through a very interesting journey during lockdown. I think in the early stages of lockdown, we suddenly all became human again.
Yeah.
Because it was almost like it was a wake-up call for so many of us. We were, on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We went straight from self-actualization right back down to the very basic needs around food, water, running out, getting as many toilet rolls as possible.
Exactly.
So people reconnected and people saw the humanism in the relationships that they had. But then something happened where I then started hearing from the organizations I worked with, I'm actually busier now working remotely than I was when I was working physically face to face, because now I literally go from a meeting straight into another meeting. I have more meetings. I have more tasks in my diary now that other people are putting in than I had before. So we went from being really human, and then something changed. We became very task orientated again. And to some extent, we went far too the other side of the pendulum to where we'd been before.
Yeah, exactly so. And I think there's developed in many organisations a level of paranoia at the top about what's going on. We saw that how many leaders really saw themselves as overseers and supervisors, and that they wanted to know exactly what people were doing, and now they couldn't see them anymore. Back to the gripping analogy, isn't it? They felt they'd lost grip over people.
It is about gripping, and I did some consultancy with a healthcare provider. 1,200 people in this, no, 1,400 people in this healthcare organisation, and I must have done something like 29 focus groups and 30 sort of one-to-one interviews, and consistently the feedback was that I feel like I'm being micromanaged. I feel like for the last 2 years we worked in a command and control environment where the executive team, as a leader myself, a junior leader, the executive team have reached over my shoulder and told me how to do my job, and I feel suffocated as a consequence. And this must be happening in a lot of organizations, driven by this sense of paranoia.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, going back to something we said before, this thing about people aren't talking to you, they're talking to the person that's behind them, because they're thinking about what they would think of what they're just saying. So they end up kind of amplifying each other's paranoia because they're all afraid to be the one that is out of step, or that is too soft, or that it looks like they've lost control, or isn't delivering their results and things. And so it ends up making everything worse rather than better.
I think this is a really good example of the dangers of groupthink and echo chambers. Unless you have a fresh voice in the room saying something different, we're simply just going to be echoing each other's concerns, paranoias, fears, more than half of which aren't even justified, to be honest. But the impact and the impact that they have is phenomenal on the other people in the organisation.
Goes back to your point about real diversity and about difference. That one of the great values of really actually embracing diversity rather than tolerating it, having policies for it, is that you get those different perspectives, you get those different life experiences. You're liable to end up in a different place because you're getting contributions from people who've walked a different path to you and don't have to walk yours.
Yeah.
And it's so powerful in the organisations that get it. I just don't think there are enough of them yet.
Something else that you mentioned, Nigel, and I think as two non-conformists, I think we need to talk about this, is policy. And how many organisations hide behind hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of policies that they've created over time, and they almost create like this castle wall of policies from behind which they can protect themselves. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, exactly right. I think that's entirely true. And for me, it comes to intent. What's your intent in creating something? Is it to protect yourself against some kind of legislation or litigation, or is it to help people understand what the rules of engagement and behaviour are? And where you see people, particularly, for example, in really good HR people who create policies for the greater good, you get a very different result to the ones who create it to make sure they can't be sued.
And that feeds into something that I've always talked about, the two kinds of HR people. You have the HR people that are constantly driven by a defensive mentality and therefore policy driven, dotting the T's and checking the I's all the time. Yeah. And I think there's a new kind of HR person evolving now. That is the HR person that understands the business needs, understands the people in the organization, and wants to do everything they can to get the very best out of the people and demonstrate some real leadership.
When I'm talking to CEOs, quite often their view of the role of HR is very insightful. Because if the CEO has this view of seeing them as incredibly important and the voice of the people, and to understand as a kind of a temperature check of what's going on, you can get real benefit out of it. If they see them as the one that they hope is keeping everything under control so they don't get any hassle, then you get a very different kind of result.
And therein lies the answer to the thinking of that CEO and the culture of the organisation, which is, largely what we've been talking about. Yeah. Nigel, I want to thank you. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you for sharing your vast amount of experience in leadership, and keep fighting the good fight. I know that you're still doing it, and I look forward to meeting you sometime, and maybe I might just take a trip out to beautiful Norfolk at some point.
That would be excellent.
All the very best.
Thanks then.